So this video will cover three main topics: what makes an argument logical, how do you counter one, and how to create multi-argumental structures, with this being an example of one. Although, as you can tell from the length of the video, it's going to be significantly more complicated than just that, but these are just the broad segments. And although this text might seem quite intimidating, in truth it's actually very simple. But before we get into that, we need to start at the very, very basics. So, what even is a sentence? And I think the best way to describe it is that sentence, or arguments in general, are just the strings of connected information. So it's something like X equals bad. It's going to take a while to write it all down, but or maybe something like Y leads to Z. And keep in mind, a sentence can be made up of multiple of these pieces of information together. So it's like it can only communicate one single thing. And the reason why this is so important is because, as you can now see in this text wall, and we'll purely focus on this part because it's the most important. I mean, I'll touch upon the rest later, but the basic idea is that information requires evidence, because basis is just, as said here, it's basically just evidence. Like, I just use a different word for it because I just thought it sounded better. And the basic idea is that every single one of these pieces of information requires some kind of evidence for it. And there's many types of evidence, by the way. Logic, and in general using words in communication, is in a way extension of our basic senses. Our senses are just, although this is getting into like even more basic parts of reality, but our senses are the most basal type of evidence. And you can communicate to somebody, for instance, your senses. This is also the most basal extension of somebody, or I guess your senses. But that somebody tells you that, oh, this is hot, this is cold, this is dangerous, this is something dangerous, maybe a bit too abstract, but cold, hot, like anyway, they can see maybe a lion 20 meters away. Like, this is the basic ideas that, and again, every single one of these things requires some kind of evidence. Now, what we've said here, like, it would, for instance, not work if we said that somebody says that they see a lion, but you know, through the context, that they are blind, and also that there are no lions here because you're inside of your own house. Now, of course, I mean, there could be lions there, but how could it be 20 meters away when your house doesn't even have, it's not even like the length of 20 meters, and at any point of the, well, maybe you see it throughout the window or something, but they are not looking through a window, they are in a windowless room. So again, context matters. And studies, of course, that type of evidence, this is generally what we can say, or what I generally would refer to. Let's say that you have some kind of study which says that X equals, but there's a problem. It says that X equals, I don't know, let's say it equals Y. And the problem is Y does not equal bad. So this is a really important distinction here. And the thing is that this ties into the idea of bridge, because bridge is just the connection between information and the basis. I don't know why I extended like that, but the general idea is that for any given piece of information, let's say a different type of information, let's say that X leads to event X leads to event Y. This is your claim, and your evidence for that is a study which says that event A, let's say it leads to, I don't know, B or something like that. I wanted to go with something different than just event leads to another event, but let's just go with that. And the problem is, of course, that there's just no connection between either A and X, or B and X, or B and Y. Basically, the problem is that even if there's a connection, this specific claim fails to illustrate that. You have to make a multiple sentence structure that essentially links these things together, but currently they're not even linked. There isn't even a connection between them. It's like fails at the most basic level of multiple sentence structure, in this case, like even basic like evidence. Like, there's just no, the bridge is basically completely violated, and currently the bridge is just more of a metaphor. Again, is the connection between them, is the fact that this says, is it linked some way to this, and how strong is the link? Again, it depends. Both bridge and the basis are generally more like, as said here, it's like it depends on the strength of the evidence. This is the basic idea of it. And by the way, all pieces of information are connected through these kinds of signs, like the either proportionality or equaling to, or just leading towards something, maybe being a this is a larger group than B, and B is a smaller group, or maybe B is inside A. Like, for instance, it could be like I don't know, England, let's just draw England is okay, this is more than just England, but England has, I don't know, London inside it. I don't know how to draw London. I guess London would just be like a very, it's just a lot of skyscrapers. I actually don't know how many skyscrapers are in London, but it's a pretty depressing city. So yeah, this is London. As you can, yeah, I think you can kind of tell that. And obviously you can have further things like maybe inside London there's a car, for instance. I don't know. Maybe there's a car. Maybe there's. It's a pretty long car. But it's a car nonetheless. Now, because the segment is getting kind of long, and because I think a lot of this stuff is pretty obvious, I will only try to summarize this textual. You can read it if you want, but the general idea is that true information requires evidence, because depending on the strength of the evidence, the likelihood of that information being true increases, well, just increases pretty much. And that ties into, well, actually you can say this ties into the fact that true information is synonymous with logical information, because where at least I mean something being logical, I just mean something that's either truthful, leads us towards the truth, or just outright, or just at least aligns how reality operates. And I think information requiring evidence, which increases the likelihood of that information being true, which is based upon this particular part, which we'll get to in a second, but I think it aligns pretty well with how reality operates. And the reason why I said we will get into that part, because all of this is pretty much the flow of this textual. I will give one evidence, because I don't want to like spend too much time on this, but keep my answer created in like 10 minutes, so there are certain like problems here, like with this being applied to be multiplication when it actually isn't supposed to be multiplication. But the reason why I want to mention the fact that information doesn't equal true information, even though you might have thought that it's so obvious, doesn't really require any evidence, but is that people very quickly forget that the moment any moment of fact they either like the information being said, or that in fact in general things just get very controversial. And the reason why this isn't, by the way, this isn't just because people can lie and be wrong, is that on a fundamental level, what we want reality to be does not equal what reality actually is. In fact, technically speaking, this is something you can actually check yourself. I mean, you can decide to change some aspect of reality, like in your head, right now, in fact, and then obviously look for whatever it did actually change. But there's a reason why it sounds so stupid. Look, if I made a full video series just explaining how wrong this idea is, it would not do this topic justice. Now, for the example sentence, and believe me, I will try to get through the other segments faster, but as you can kind of see, its basis is what I like to call the trust me bro science. It is the science of the average person. In fact, 98% of all scientists you ever continue in your whole life use that as the basis. No, some people might be able to, might actually have their level, because you see, from your perspective, because again, this is assuming you're the one hearing this, from your perspective, this is the basis. If you're the one saying this, you presumably have some other basis, and this would be more so, well, it actually wouldn't even be necessary, because you presumably need to trust yourself. Although that's, I guess, arguable in some situations. Anyway, the point is that normally, like, the memories and feelings, and in this case, for instance, the bridge saying that presumably chocolate equals good, they like chocolate, and again, you need to say the exact same thing, because the information and the basis need to be exactly the same. In fact, information is arguably the conclusion of the basis, but sadly, for most of, especially stuff on the internet, because you presumably don't trust a lot of, especially people in the comments, you have no reason to trust them. You don't know them. They may be lying, they may be wrong, unless they actually use some kind of specific evidence for that. You can pretty much dismiss like 99% of all sentences on the internet or arguments just through that, especially in the comment section. It's actually kind of sad if you think about it. And yeah, this is why this segment, by the way, existed, because a lot of people, despite it being theoretically so obvious, will literally just say something and then believe it's true because they just like the information. Now, there's three main ways to counter information. Although before we get into any of that, I need to introduce a very important concept here. Let me just switch us to brush. It's basically that information is often backed by other pieces of information. This is its argument for it. I should probably just call it the argument, let's say, and it's backing this. Now, you see, there's a few important pieces of, I guess you can say, information here, and it's that if you use counter evidence, which we'll get to in a second, against this, you're not fundamentally countering this argument, as in. So, counter evidence does not fundamentally counter arguments for this original information. And there's also some types of arguments or information that can't even be countered by counter evidence. So, example being studies. So, let's say somebody has a study A, which tells you that that I know a lion is weighs, let's say, weighs 380 kilograms. Okay, but somebody said, but actually I have a study called Study B, and that Study B actually tells me that a lion weighs, let's just write it more quickly, weighs 298 tons. It's a pretty large beast. That's what the study says. I'm not the one creating it. It's like, this is what a person found. This is the study. Some person created the study, and I don't know how they did that, but it must have been a pretty big lion. But the point is that you can say you've quote unquote counted, again, quote unquote counted the piece of information here, but you did not fundamentally counter the study. The study is still a piece of information that backs the original claim here. And this is just like we still don't know what lion actually weighs. And again, we will get that in a second. How do we actually measure that? Because, well, obviously we look at both of these, but again, we'll get into that in a second. But fundamentally, the only way to counter studies is to attack its basis or its bridge. So the connection between this and this is somehow wrong, or maybe there's some original problem with the study itself. Of course, this study is perfect. But let's get into specifics. So let's give an example of, let's say somebody based on the memories and the feelings remembers that and a component of B, and we'll get to a component in a second, they're basically just pieces of information tied into the original. So let's say the B is a trait, some kind of evolutionary trait, and this means advantage. So whatever this trait is advantageous depends, well, again, it depends on the A. Although the A, you can say the A is the connected piece of information, so it depends on the basis of these two things. But let's say he remembers that it's true. And, already I should say, but somebody then says, well, actually, I know a study called Study 1, which actually says that, well, this trait is not at all advantageous, and this is actually false. And this would be an example of counter evidence. And the way you would actually then conclude the topic is by looking at, assuming none of these can be countered, is by looking at the evidence for and against it and concluding which one's actually stronger. So let's say that the memories and feelings of that person, he decides, are significantly stronger than any actual objective studies, because obviously that's true. Or if he's a bit more logical, he might say, well, actually, I trust my professor more than like a random study you pulled up. And that's beside the fact that maybe he just doesn't, because like you see the bridge between all of us, maybe also because there's several bridges here. You need to trust that person that study says that, and study else needs to say that for that to be true. And he can then conclude, well, I don't really trust, I trust my professor more, and something, something like that, basically. But let's instead say that you actually wanted to counter the feelings and memories of the original person. You said, I want to prove him wrong. I don't want him to have that cope that, his professor is okay. What could you possibly do? So, as an example, you can pull up a document that says that actually the memories and feelings of that person are actually implanted. They were put in the head by the agency that you work for, and presuming obviously that implanted memories and feelings, because this ties into multi-argumental structures actually. You see, this is another piece of evidence, another component connected to this, or just a piece of evidence that's connected to this. And if this is true, if my memories are true, then that apparently is connected to the fact that means that the memories and feelings are false. And there's some evidence for that. And this is basically the structure you'll go with. So here's a document, and that's your basis that he's actually wrong, that his memories are implanted, and implanted memories are wrong memories, they're false memories, and therefore feelings and memories are wrong. And there you go, just countered his original argument. You're incredible. But you see, he's also pretty stubborn, and he's like, well, actually, I have some evidence that it's actually you. No, wait, there would just be another evidence. Yeah, he could say that, okay, your memories and feelings are actually, or like, your memories and feelings of this document being given to you, and you planting these memories in my head actually planted by me and my agency. But let's put that aside, because let's focus on the bridge. You see, he actually counters that this part here, the memories and feelings that are implanted do not actually equal false, basically. Um, this is actually wrong, and he gives some kind of evidence for it. He attacks the connection essentially between these two facts, and he says, okay, my memories and feelings might be implanted in my head, but it doesn't mean they are false. I think, based on some evidence, that they actually still true. Like, they are real memories that they can connect to. Just because they didn't happen in real life doesn't mean they are false. Something like that, basically, and here's some kind of evidence for it. Again, it could just be reasoning they've presented here, but I'm not sure this is some kind of, again, this isn't really a evidence, although you can argue in this case this is framing, because you see, anyway, this stuff is pretty much dependent on the definition of what do you mean by false, and then you can actually use your different definition, although again that depends. Can you actually? That itself, it will be a different discussion, and actually that pretty well ties into multi-argumental structures. This is when things get actually too complicated, and I have no idea how to quickly explain this. I think this is going to get very long, but let's start with the because, like, again, even though it seems even it's not actually as complicated as it seems. It's significantly easier once you actually get to the actual I don't know, the actual arguments. But you already kind of also know components and connection signs. I introduced both before, so you already have some basic background. And also another thing that I introduced before is the x and y, specifically again these arguments, and they have some kind of theoretical evidence for them. I'm not even going to bother referencing that because this is the ideal model for now, of the basic model, basic and ideal model. And this essentially says that A equals B, and this says that B equals C. Now, at the start of the video, you probably have already noticed that okay, yeah, this is C. That the line went from B to B, and if you did and thought, okay, well, this is probably the connection sign, you were correct. These are the keychain arguments. This is going to what's going to connect all essentially ideas, and this works for, again, pretty much all ideas. And the again, the connection signs, it's like a whole language. There's many different types of connection signs. There's the if connection signs. There are the either inside physically, or maybe this is inside a group. There's the equaling to or proportional. It could just be proportional. Again, it's because this is for like real life. We have to take certain like so something 2 times y and then x. I mean, this may not be exactly equal, but the basic idea is that they are supposed to be proportional, and again, this would still work. And what did I mention? Also, the actual argumental models are basically, so example, if statement is like if x, then y, and then let's say another argument is that if y, then z, then obviously it means that x leads to z. And this is the same with events. If you have x, y, and z, and again, this is the ideal. In reality, it never works like that, but you feel to have x always leading to z. In reality, you have probabilities and uncertainties in terms of whatever is even true, but probabilities also, even if this was true. And then x might lead to z, depending on some circumstances which are outside of this specific structure. And yeah, this is the basic model essentially. The last thing missing is just that all of this, if we create multi-argumental structures, would require foundational evidence. And foundational evidence is just the concept that the multi-argumental structures need to reference reality at the very beginning. So you have some kind of it depends. We actually, we need to actually create some kind of structure for this to truly understand that. So I already wrote all of this stuff down because I want to get to the explanation immediately, and this takes a while to draw. It's kind of an experiment, you can say, in the video, but the basic idea is that you have some kind of argument. Let's say x leads to y. This is an event, obviously, although it doesn't technically have to be, but anyway. And then y leads to z. Again, these are just as the math, these are just the metaphorical representation of. You can put anything that actually would fit into the given description of leading to something else. And as long as these principles hold, then you see, because again, every statement is evidence. So the evidence for x leading to y is there's some kind of study which says that x leads to y. They checked it in reality. We're presuming that somehow this is a perfect study. It always is the case because again, this is the ideal model. And here's one of the things that actually get more interesting, because you see the evidence for this is that if you have this is another completely different idea, that if you have two different ideas like A and B, and they have components called T, then they will always lead to each other. And because both of these have this component called T, therefore this is true, and therefore they will lead to each other. And obviously that means that, and again, because there's a perfect universe, they will always lead to each other, so therefore X will lead to Z, because, well, it will lead to Y, and then Y will lead to Z. These are, again, the key chain arguments. And presumably, this also ideally should reference some kind of evidence, which then references some kind of evidence, which presumably should reference ideally something within reality. So by building a lot of these basic structures, and this will tie heavily into the greater system of logic, which I haven't even mentioned that, but everything that I've said in this video is just the lesser system of logic. The greater system of logic is going to mention at the end. I don't want to spend pretty much any time on this because the idea for it is actually very simple. And it's impossible to explain it. It's like this is you'll understand at the end, but this is how you presumably build these structures. And again, everything, even like things you might not think in reality. Like example, morality is also referencing reality. We'll get that. Like example, maybe something like let's say wherever an action is wrong isn't really that subjective, because references morality, which then references like care about other people. And what do I mean care about other people? It then references pretty much what their happiness, their suffering. Again, this is happiness, this is suffering, and that is something we can actually check within reality. And even if we don't have technology to do that yet, we will be able probably in the future. And we probably add it to some degree can. Even then we can reason things out, like this is something that we can like look for evidence in reality. I think this might be a good introduction to the webs of logic. So webs of logic basically is the idea that all concepts pretty much are connected to some other concepts through the previously mentioned connection signs. So example being B might rise proportionally with 2 times y being some other concept. And in another case, like if G, which is a trait of B, or actually component of B, then 2 being another metaphorical representation of a concept. And by the way, components are ideas like dangerous, advantageous, like they are basically descriptionary terms of already existing ideas. There may be more to it than that, but again, this is for now the definition I'm going with. And there's 3 ways, by the way, to connect ideas. So it's by definitions. So either by definition, like right and wrong, an example, they reference another idea. It could be by subtext, which this is a bit more complicated, and we'll get to that. And finally, the components, although they are like the most basic connections in a way. And you can argue even, like, again, these basic and dangerous are something like pretty much components of everything. So let's use right and wrong as an example. So they are concepts which can, at least, I mean, they don't have to reference morality, can reference like practicality and stuff. It depends on the context, but they often reference morality. And morality generally is a system in which we presumably care about other people. Now, most of the time people put in some other things there as well, but it's more like a rule system. But generally speaking, this is how it gains its legitimacy. Most model systems gain the legitimacy by supposedly caring about other people. And caring about other people, what does it actually mean? So internal state of other people, and obviously the difference is presumably their happiness, suffering, stuff like that. So this kind of brings us also nicely into final 2 categories here, which is the inverse diving and higher reasoning, higher principle. So inverse diving sounds pretty complicated. In a way, it kind of is, but it's the idea that we either ask questions, basically, this is how we look for subtext in given ideas. So something like, why did you help somebody? Well, they say because he's cold. He's cold, right? That's why he helped him. And this seemingly, at least not by its very definition, it doesn't really connect to any other ideas, but subtextually, it's a action reasoning, which connects to, again, action reasoning, and that connects to morality. Again, I'm not going to write all of these connections because there's just probably way too many of them, but this connects again to morality, and Well, yeah, this is what inverse diving would do. We ask questions like, okay, why did you do that? Well, because something, and then actually they may immediately reference morality. So, however they even necessary, like you get to that, you presumably arrive at morality, unless this is actually like very practical. Like I'd say, okay, I didn't want to get sued or something like that. Could happen. Now, definition is what I actually did here actually, and this was I didn't even explain. This is actually what is the definition in inverse diving. We would look for right and wrong, look for its definition, which presumably will reference morality. We look for morality. Basically, right and wrong is just the way to put it right is that it's a plus to morality, and plus to morality is basically equivalent to and let's say some kind of happiness plus for humanity. So in a way, right is just this. All of these things are again equal, meaning it equal. Again, it is exchangeable. It's like mathematical basics. This is how we use these mathematical terms in reality. This is why I said it's more complicated. Like it seems a lot of these things seem very simple, but in practice, like there's a reason why most people actually use that, even though it's seemingly so simple. We just use these equal sign and get to happiness. Again, I'm not saying by the way that this is simplification. Like we have to get into very deeply into like utilitarianism, stuff like that. Now, this video is already getting so long, it doesn't really matter if I extend it just a little bit. And here's two, therefore, other models. Firstly, there's the possibilities model, which is that basically that we know that B is connected to some kind of C idea, but we don't know what that idea is. So as an example, imagine something like we have an empty room, this is B, and it's connected to some kind of reasoning for us. We don't know what this reasoning is. And we basically look at the possibilities and evidence for each and every single one of these possibilities. And then, well, assuming they're all equal, then we just divide by the number of the possibilities. Again, the likelihood of each being true. But obviously, if there's some evidence for them, then they changes. Things need to add that up as well. And here, by the way, it was supposed to be. This is what the possibilities that we just maybe have in front of, because there's always a possibility that we just have in front of something. In fact, it's probably very likely. It depends how long we actually thought about a given topic, and we need to take that into account as well. How likely is there to be another possibility? It depends on a given topic. Now, the other is the comparison model, and the comparison model is basically when people use comparison example being, okay, well, if A was true, then wouldn't B be true? And this, by the way, means true. Both of them. This is like a programming kind of simplification, but now, the way this should be used is that if A, then B, but B, we know that, we presumably know that we have some kind of evidence for it, that B equals false. But the problem is that this is often completely neglected. There's only this part is actually being used in the actual comparison, so hence why I created this model, so that ideally at least people who know a little bit about philosophy will stop making this mistake. I have no hope for the average person. And finally, whatever higher principles, or higher reasoning, again, whatever you want to call that. So here's an example of how you might use higher principles. So let's say that you have some idea, I wrote it here as false, but let's just say it's actually wrong. So X is actually wrong, some kind of action is wrong. And this is because of A plus B. That's why there's this arrow here. Now, what this actually really means is that A plus B equals false, because we're really saying that this is the key. This is the reasoning for us. It's not like the action itself, is that there's some kind of components, presumably that, or some other ideas that are related to this action, parts of this action, if you will, that make this the case. Otherwise, you wouldn't even need this reasoning. You would just say that this inherently is wrong. And why this is wrong? Well, presumably this by itself doesn't really tie into moral system. It's just, this is like, I guess you can say a higher action. So it's a action, but again, the action itself is not what makes something wrong. It's instead some kind of reasoning that ties into morality itself. Again, going by small, the more basic components of things. So again, it's kind of the inverse diving. But what it actually means is that, again, A plus B equals false. And now that means that every single idea that has this A plus B components is therefore or wrong, I guess, because I've used wrong as an example, is therefore wrong. And here's the problem. Often people don't actually use that. They will just explain this reasoning, but they will never apply this reasoning to other situations. And again, once you actually start having these principles, you'll be very frustrated with the average person. Because they never apply these principles. They will just rationalize any given opinion or some kind of reasoning for any given opinion. But you can just tell that they don't have it because let's say that even popular opinions justified using this will then have other implications that are just not thought of popularly. I won't give any examples, at least not in this video. partially because we just don't have time. But now the key here is that if that indeed is the case, if we find out no, we actually don't actually fully agree with it. Like let's say that you use that principle, you apply this, and you will actually know because of some other factors. Well, here's the problem: if that is indeed the case, that means that a plus b does not equal wrong, not by itself. Well, they actually would create it as a plus b, and I don't know what exactly, and or actually if would be a better way to put it. If RGB, then only then does it equal wrong. That essentially meant that this original statement a plus b equals false again by itself was enough, which then obviously also means that a plus b is not enough of a justification to claim that x equals false, because again this is supposed to be the justification. It has these components and it makes it false, but again these components are wrong. These components are by itself, they're not wrong. And this is really important. Again, the concept of high principles essentially that you try to there's actually several sub rules here. I don't want I can't really, we don't have time to cover all of them, but the idea would be that ideally you would get to these higher principles in every single situation. And in a way, this is also comparisons. Like this is the similar idea to comparisons, but here it also just means that if you create these sort of pieces of information like a plus b equals false, if this was actually true indeed, then every single idea that has these components will be therefore wrong. It essentially forcefully connects every single idea with these components. And all ideas are connected to this idea. Either way, it depends what we actually fit these a plus b's with. But every single thing is connected to it. And this is what I'm saying. Like sometimes these connections are not really obvious from the actual definition. In fact, even in the question that we're not connected, it's just that these high principles would automatically apply. Again, these are like the certain connections between these subcomponents of certain ideas that we can then use to if we know that they are true, we can then apply these ideas to know something about them. And well, like I've kind of made an example of the multi-argumental chains of logic, we can create very complex system using these things, because again, this was just like the most simplified example of that, but it will get significantly complicated if we actually started applying this in practice. Although, as you might be thinking now, this is very complicated. Like you as a person, singular person, would have a very, very hard time like noting all of this stuff down. How are you supposed to do this? Wow. And this is where we get to the outro and the greatest system of logic. You see, the whole point of the greatest system of logic is that once we actually start noting all of the arguments, counter-arguments, again, so basically the way this would work is that we would, again, know the arguments, counter-arguments against a given topic, and because we have the models for what makes an argument, what counters a given argument, and of course what counters these given counter-arguments, stuff like that, and of course, how do we conclude a given topic? We can now, unlike previously, even if we did note all of this stuff down, it would be very subjective. Like, how do we know whether an argument counters another? Well, now we do. And with that, we can then note these things, note all of the evidence that we have for a given topic, and then basically objectively conclude what is the given conclusion of a given idea. And this is only possible, and again, I think I've already implied that, but this will be not on an individual basis like we do right now. We kind of conclude and decide ourselves what is the case, but this is essentially an extension of science into philosophy. So this will essentially allow us to note all of this stuff down on a either civilization or maybe even worldwide basis, not all of the arguments against a given topic, and then conclude again what is the the conclusion of a given topic. It depends somewhat on the given topic, obviously. It depends whatever we measure, whatever the idea is true, whatever idea is correct, it's beneficial to society. It, again, depends very much on what are we discussing. But this was a huge problem for humanity, because you see, for the longest time, we never really, like, somebody could make the most brilliant argument, and it wouldn't particularly matter. Most factions historically don't really know the most brilliant arguments for a given ideas. Now, of course, there are some people who we have noted arguments for, but we don't even necessarily we have ways to measure them. We don't really build upon them that often. There are some exceptions, but so what? They're just exceptions. Generally speaking, we don't really build upon this knowledge. And even if somebody counters them, we don't even have ways to. We didn't have ways to actually know whatever they did counter them. Now we do. And again, this allows for the existence for the greatest system of logic, because again, once we note all of this stuff down, well, again, we can know the objective conclusion of a given topic. And you might say that, or you might try to counter this by saying that, well, what if I'm wrong about this? Because, of course, if I'm wrong about some of these models, then this will disallow the proper function of the greatest system of logic. But you see, and of course, I should actually mention that, yes, you could be correct, but I could be wrong about a lot of these things. But you see, I don't really think that particularly matters, because even if I'm wrong about some of these things, I can just upgrade them. This isn't the first version of the system. I've worked on this for, at this point, like 2 years essentially, and I've upgraded it many times over. Like, this isn't the final version. This is still going to get worked on. Some of the things that here are not created, some of the things are not properly, they're not created, some of the things are not properly ordered. Again, there's a lot of things here that are imperfect, but I can just build upon what I already created. Like, and the very idea of this is going to be something that's probably going to be very tempting to some people. I mean, even you might already be tempted by this. I mean, the very idea of being able to objectively measure the conclusion of a topic is, I mean, again, it depends on the person. Some people might be somewhat scared about this, and for good reason probably, since this removes all human bias. It makes it that you can't just try to rationalize the topic, because now, again, the implications of this, and they get noted down. Even if you have a counter argument, we already know whatever it is counter or not, and even if it isn't, like, again, we can just note it, and then, again, all of the world, presumably, again, metaphorically speaking, all of the humanity can basically counter this, because presumably it would be like, again, it depends how this will be done precisely, but presumably this will be like done kind of publicly, so we essentially have, I don't know, whatever the website, whatever it is, it's like a database or something, but basically there we note again all of the arguments, counter arguments, and anybody can pretty much contribute to it, and this is the really important part. This allows, again, for the combination of the knowledge of all of humanity, pretty much, like obviously not literally, but yeah, this has a ton of implications, and I'm not going to mention even scratch the very surface of all of them, because there's just simply too many of them, and there's too many like things for me to like arguments and too many things for me to like mention. But I'll just end it with saying that the lesser system of logic, I think, is going to get accepted, because of course it will probably need to be refined and changed somewhat, but I think in some ways it's going to get accepted, especially like the most basic information basis bridge idea is very, very, very solid. But I don't know about the greater system of logic, you see, because the greater system of logic, well, it might get accepted until we actually start using this, because once we start using this, you will see, like, for at the start, people might still be optimistic, like think that, by objectively, you will just objectively prove their existing beliefs, which is pretty funny, because you see, reality doesn't have biases that we do. Reality doesn't really care about us, that civilization, doesn't really care about our period of time specifically, or our given society. It's not going to perfect any given society or structure, but just statistically speaking, because of just how many options there are. It's pretty much just going to give us like the hard truth that we probably, we're literally not designed to actually get. So this is why I will say that, and again, there's a lot of scientific evidence, psychological specifically, to suggest that we are very biased as humans. That's a whole other topic, but yeah, all I can really say is things are gonna get very interesting.